And
Yeah.
I think we'll see that, with coders, with cybersecurity professionals, we may not have to do a lot of the mundane tasks as AIs get better, but it'll be our jobs to actually, how do we deploy that tool? How do we optimize that tool? How do we make sure the tool's getting the right data or seeing the right things and keep it in check? And let's face it, we're seeing examples today where AIs can go astray fairly quickly. So the cybersecurity professional of 5 years from now is going to be the cybersecurity AI professional, because they're going to need to protect the AI that's protecting them from attack. And so that will be the new surface area.
What a fascinating world we're moving into, huh?
Indeed, indeed.
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
Hi there, everybody. This is Mark Verbenkoff, and welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. This is episode number 144. So, in numerous episodes over the last year or so, we've been talking about artificial intelligence's impact on various industries, as well as businesses, and in general, our lives. As the hype for AI seems to be continuing with the new releases, the new tools, and I guess just the general excitement about updates, like the most recent OpenAI's GPT-4o, this topic seems to become more and more relevant as the use of AI continues to grow. But with that growth, I think also comes increased security issues. Just like how previous digital technologies like computers or even the internet increase what I like to call the surface area for attacks, so too is artificial intelligence increasing the number of targets for the would-be attackers out there, the malicious actors, but also supercharging the security experts in their defensive actions. And as I've talked about on the podcast before, cybersecurity, I really think, is going to be an increasingly important topic in I like to call it the fascinating world of technological change that we find ourselves in. And I'm more than happy to have Steve Orrin, this is Intel's Federal CTO, as a guest today to talk about cybersecurity and this new AI age that we are finding ourselves in. So in this episode, we discuss how cybersecurity has changed over the years, the role that AI is playing in both the private and public sectors, how cybersecurity work is really transformed by AI applications, the future of cybersecurity and AI, and the role that Intel is playing, as well as many other topics. So Steve Orrin, who is this? Steve Orrin advises federal agencies, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community on all facets of technology. Steve is a cybersecurity expert and has influenced the evolution of the company's cybersecurity strategy. He has led security initiatives within multiple product groups, including security reviews, the examination of emerging threats, and company-wide training on security awareness. In a previous life, Steve was the CSO for Sarvega, CTO of Sanctum, CTO and co-founder of Lockstar, and CTO at Syndata Technologies. I had a fascinating discussion with him, and I hope and I definitely think that you will get some benefit out of the discussion. Great. Well, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today, Steve, to talk a little bit about cybersecurity and this new hype wave that we're going through with AI and how that's impacting cybersecurity. So yeah, thanks again for coming on and taking the time to talk to me.
My pleasure, Mark. Looking forward to this.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I like to start most of my podcast off with my guests is like how you initially got into the industry or focus on the technology or the specific topic that you're into. So of course you've been in cybersecurity for many years. I think if I remember hearing correctly, you were working on everything cybersecurity related above the Intel chips. Right, so not the chip itself, but like operating systems, web, etc. So, could you maybe share with the audience like what initially got you interested in that cybersecurity aspect?
Sure thing, and it actually goes back to even before my startup days. So as a kid, I was a hacker. I liked playing with technology and seeing how things both worked or didn't work, how things fell apart, whether that was sort of some of the technologies around computing or taking apart the remote and not being able to pull it back together again, but really just trying to understand how things worked. And that was my passion, one of my major passions and interests. But back in the late 80s and early 90s, there really wasn't a career path for cybersecurity at that time, or the internet, because it hadn't really boomed.
Right.
And my other passion and love was biology. And so actually I went the route of bioresearch and got a degree in research biology, did some graduate work. And then right before I had to start med school, I had an opportunity to help a friend of a friend get a company up and running. This was mid-95, so pre-Netscape IPO, right at the earliest stages of the internet boom. And he was looking to do something in the security space, didn't really know what. And they said, hey, you're a hacker kind of guy. You know this stuff. Why don't you help him out? And I'm like, well, it'd be something interesting to do and maybe make some money to pay for med school. And so I jumped on that opportunity back in mid-95. And after about 3 months of getting that company up and running and developing the technology, I was in love. It was just the most fascinating time. It was early stages of the industry. Anything was possible. And along with the great opportunity and some really good mentors, I just went all in. And after about 3 or 4 months, I told my parents I wasn't going to go to med school, which took some convincing.
Sure.
But I did 4 startups throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and then my 4th startup was acquired by Intel and came into Intel. And as you mentioned, at the time they were very focused on just the chips and the chip architecture. And their research was much more hardware focused and developing security into the chip. And the VP of the software group at that time, Renee James, who later went on to become president of Intel, had this idea of forming what she called a pathfinding team. And it was basically a team to look at sort of the 2 to 5 year horizon. So not developing new hardware necessarily, but what could you do different with the hardware that's available today or what was coming out maybe in a year or so from now, from that time. And so she was standing up this team and asked me if I wanted to run security pathfinding. And I thought this is an opportunity to sort of play CTO, but with Intel's budget, I'm all in.
Right,
and so
right.
I did that for 9 years. And as you said, looking at sort of the fluffy stuff that ran on top of the chip, web technologies, early virtualization and cloud before anyone really knew how to spell it, anti-malware techniques that could leverage hardware. So looking at ways to innovate up the stack by trying to solve cybersecurity problems, whether that be deep visibility or scale, or being able to do remote attestation, all those kind of use cases that rode above the chip, but really enabled the end customer. And so looking at those areas, we developed the first trusted cloud architectures for how do you deploy clouds in a trustworthy way and use hardware to help enforce those controls. We looked at ways we could accelerate or make antivirus and anti-malware scanners and agents more secure or get deeper visibility into what's really going on in the system to detect those really powerful malware attacks. And so a lot of that innovation was done as part of that pathfinding. And then from there, I got the opportunity, going almost 10 years ago, to take on the role of Federal CTO as Intel was starting to invest and build out a federal capability. And they gave me the opportunity to go beyond even just cybersecurity, but look at all the things that Intel does, focused on a fairly important and broad customer in the federal government.
That's a really interesting career path. So very happy to have you on to talk a little bit more about all this stuff. Maybe before we get going, so I'm old enough to remember a time without the internet. Not for a very long time, but I was certainly around before the internet came. You've been, dealing with this stuff for a while. Was there any jarring or interesting or weird event or I guess you could even say industry where you thought whoa, cybersecurity is impacting this, hackers are impacting this? Because I think back in the day, as you said, it just wasn't around. It wasn't happening. And now almost everything can be kind of hacked. We're talking in a couple of years about hacking humans, right? So, but that's in a couple of years, anyways.
Yeah, it's still a ways off, although we're getting close with some of the embedded medical devices.
Yeah.
I think there were a couple of times throughout my career where we saw the shift, if you will, from it being solely about what could happen to looking at what is happening. And I think we've seen that in a couple of cases, and some of it has to do with some major attacks that have happened. The other is really just seeing the shift in the adversary. So we've seen viruses and malware for years. I mean, it's been, the earliest Morris worm was, an example going back, now almost 40 years. But what we found is that the technologies that the adversaries are using map to the technologies that we're all using. They get the scaling benefit of web, of services, of cloud, of AI, machine learning. So every time there's an innovation in the, in the private and public sector, in the industry on the positive side, the adversaries are absolutely taking advantage of. So we see that sort of correlation in that cat and mouse, where oftentimes they're a leap ahead because they're doing things that the rest of the industry just hasn't caught up yet, but the technology is available. I think more recently there was a really impactful example that really sort of set the stage for what we've been saying in cybersecurity for many years. A number of years ago, and not that many, was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, just after the Capitol pipeline attack on the East Coast, there was a ransomware attack of a company out of Australia called JBS. They were a meat packing company. And it shut down meat packing production, impacted the global supply chain of meat. And there were some really interesting things that you could learn from that attack that I think were representative of the broader state of cybersecurity. Number one, when you say that, oh, I'm not going to get attacked because I'm not interesting. I'm not a bank, I'm not a healthcare provider, I'm not a government, no one's going to come after me. I mean, nothing against meat packing, but you can't get any less sexy than meat packing, okay? And yet they were a target. And so it shows that everyone is in scope when it comes to cyber threat and cyber criminals. The other thing that was highlighted by that attack that didn't get the same amount of news was that a cyber attack, a ransomware attack, shut down the physical meat packing production. And what that highlighted is that even the most mundane things have become digitally dependent. So when the ransomware hit and they shut down the factory floor and the processing floor, that meant that these very manual, very what you think are person-intensive processes actually are very automated now, are relying on digital technology. And so every aspect of our lives are really dependent on the IT and OT infrastructures that we just sort of take for granted. And so that attack really highlighted something we've been saying for a long time and really brought it to bear. Everyone is potential target and will be attacked. It's not a matter of when, if, it's when. And that every aspect of our life is dependent on these technologies operating correctly and not being attacked. And so I think that, even though there's been many examples of huge attacks over the years, OPM, some of the data breaches have been just the size has gotten so big that we almost get punch drunk from, yet another data breach. 20 billion records. Well, what's that? I mean, it's a lot. But I think the thing about JBS that was really interesting is it really highlighted that fundamental shift that's been going on for a while publicly, because it was a public attack, that everyone is a target and that every aspect, things we don't think are important, but let's face it, if you can't get meat, people don't eat. That or prices go up and it affects the world economy. And so that was, I think, one of the key highlights that sort of showed why cybersecurity is so important beyond all the regulatory reasons and customer value and data that gets compromised. It's understanding that the digital transformation, the digital wave, is not happening. It's happened, and it's affected all aspects of our daily lives.
That's a really, really interesting example. And I think this is something that, even people that aren't in the technology space or any kind of technology space have some inkling now, right? Whether it's hearing about IoT, the internet is coming alive, or it's going into different physical parts of our society. There's this, I think, real deep-seated understanding that people, I guess, need to have or are starting to have that, cybersecurity is now, it's ubiquitous, right? It needs to be ubiquitous because everything is going to be able to be impacted over the next couple of years. I definitely want to jump into how AI as this new era that we're moving into is going to be impacting all this. I listened to a podcast of yours a couple of nights ago, another podcast that you were on, and you were describing what a federal CTO is. And I think that this is, I've had many CEOs and CTOs on the podcast, and this is my first time talking to a federal CTO. And I think it's really interesting. If you could just briefly describe that for the audience as well, because I think it'll help massage the conversation that we're going to have.
Sure. And I think the federal CTO is a really interesting role that Intel has crafted, and there are corollaries in other organizations that have federal CTOs. unlike technology domain CTOs that are looking at a particular technology as their area of expertise, and you'll have like a security CTO, you may have in Intel, we'll have a CPU CTO, we'll have a memory CTO, we'll have different CTOs networking for those technology domains. And then at most companies, technology providers, they'll have a CTO that sort of owns the overall architecture and vision of their products. What makes a federal CTO a little different is that my job is to look at it from both sides. I need to understand the customer environment and be able to understand how technology integrates into those enterprises, into those missions. How can the government take advantage of what's available today, as well as where you understand the roadmap, understand where technology is going, and I need to be able to speak in their language, understand what they're trying to do, whether it's civilian and USDA or forestry or NASA, military and understanding the warfighter needs, intelligence. It's really about understanding their mission so that I can help them adopt the technology. The other side of the federal CTO role is being able to translate government speak, in our case, back into Intel speak, so that our business units and our product teams can build products that meet those requirements. So translating a government mission need around, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or being able to do better citizen services at the scale that they need, and be able to translate that into the bits and bytes that are necessary to drive new product innovation for our commercial products. And then the third part of my job, which is a very fascinating part, is what I call the federalization of commercial solutions. Taking what works today in a bank or for a manufacturing company or for a retail company and giving it slight innovation twists, being able to modify and configure it and compose it to fit into a government set of requirements. Government oftentimes has higher security requirements, has environmental constraints around ruggedization or the temperatures or things that it has to operate at, which you find in other places, but they have standards for everything. Government also has a scale that you don't necessarily find in an individual bank or an individual manufacturing line. But one of the other interesting things that really, I think, makes the federal CTO a unique position and is a valuable one is that the federal government is a macrocosm of every other industry. You want to talk healthcare and insurance, the largest health provider in the world is the Veterans Administration. That can be providing services to over 16 million veterans. I mean, no single hospital or health insurer covers that scale. You want to talk about banking and financial transactions between IRS, that's the Internal Revenue Service, and CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services. They're doing payments on a scale of everyone who's over 65, for instance, for Medicaid, or everyone's tax return. So there's financial applications. They're running a lot of the same back-end systems and enterprise, and they have the same requirements for servicing their customers or their, in our case, the citizens, but being able to do it at a much more massive scale. And so what I think is really fascinating about the federal government is they have almost every kind of use case. One of my favorite examples is that you can go do logistics and supply chain with a Walmart, with a UPS and a FedEx, with the Postal Service, but you think about the scale, Defense Logistics Agency has the same problem. They've got to move, gas and jeeps and bullets and anything else that they have to get globally to be able to both serve the mission today, but also be prepared for whatever is going to come. And so they have a global supply chain and logistics management system, just like you'd find at a UPS, a DHL, or a FedEx. And so you find a lot of commonality, which means products and solutions that are built for those commercial entities have a fit in government. And vice versa, when we find an opportunity to innovate in the government, there's applicability out into the private sector.
Very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but it makes perfect sense. You mentioned a couple of the differences when you get to that kind of scale. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think it maybe just pick like one industry, like healthcare, for instance. Like you were talking about robustness, for instance, but I'm just curious about that scaling difference, and then what kind of changes need to happen for specifically cybersecurity.
So it's a really good question. When you're talking about the scale, and so we're talking about being able to service 16 million, let's say veterans in the case of the Veteran Administration, through veterans hospitals that are distributed. So it's like having a network of hospitals that are centrally managed with local administration, headquarters administration. But at the end of the day, they're doing the same thing that a Columbia Presbyterian or a Sloan Kettering is doing. They're providing healthcare services with doctors and nurses and administrators to patients on an as-needed basis. That means we need to be able to do electronic medical records and be able to share that across hospitals. Because if a veteran moves from Texas to Alaska, their records go with them as well as their guaranteed services. Similarly, the medical devices. So a lot of hospitals and the VA as well have got IoT style medical devices, internet enabled or connected medical devices that are communicating. So you need to have the standards that can communicate across hospital systems and back into the payment systems to be able to provide the insurance coverage or the payment systems. And so it's a lot of the same problems that you'd find in those individual industries, but now we're talking about a much broader scale, both from the number of veterans or in this, patients that are being serviced, but also from the number of, so let's call them regional offices, in this case, the veterans hospitals and the veterans clinics and the veterans healthcare offices that are global. So it's not just what's in the US, but at every base and at many places internationally, be able to provide those services. So on the back end side, there's a lot of scale, but also driving that capability so that I can deliver quality of service to the end customer or to the patient through the doctors, through the healthcare providers, to provide the ease of, when they come in and their record is just available. That requires a level of due diligence and optimization that often goes beyond what you'd find in a regional or even a large city hospital environment. And so they're looking at things where they can automate processes, where they can do a combination of cloud and on-prem in order to be able to service both what I need at that moment in time. I need to know what's going on, but I also need to keep populating the back-end infrastructure so that I can provide care to this individual wherever they go, as well as the data analytics to know, we're starting to see cases of something here. I need to provide the right services. And that ties in also to when you have the transition from active to veteran status, being able to prepare an environment for the influx potentially. So there's a lot of coordination, and that means building out and planning for the technologies, whether that be cloud architectures and orchestration, better devices at the edge to process those electronic medical records, to something as simple as when you get an x-ray out of the machine that it needs to be available to the doctor, but also populated into the enterprise services and available across the board. And those kind of workflows, driving those at the scale that are very similar to what you find in large scale multinational organizations, but now we're doing that for Medicare and for medical services. And so it's really about taking what we've done for others and applying it to those individual domains.
Okay. So to me, it sounds like the surface area. I mean, like we were talking about at the beginning, the surface area of the possible attacks is just ever expanding and growing in these specific cases that you're talking about. Why don't we dive into how AI is impacting this, right? So you were saying before how every new kind of large technological advancement offers defenders, but also attackers, new tools, new ways of attacking and defending. AI is still in a massive hype wave. Granted, a lot of it is hype and not real, but there are some real tools and real capabilities. How do you see, and why don't we start with attackers? How do you see attackers benefiting from this new AI wave that we're all experiencing?
So it's a really good question, Mark. And let's put one thing out on the table. The adversaries don't have to wait for business processes, quality assurance, and a board of directors to prove anything.
Yeah.
If they see a technology that's going to advance their cause, going to make them a penny per transaction more, going to get them better scale, or get them more effective outcomes, they're going to adopt it. They're going to try it. Mm-hmm. There's no bureaucracy in the way from the adversary leveraging a technology. So while on the industry side, we're seeing this hype wave of AI, and we're starting to see some implementations, but a lot of stuff is stuck in the lab someplace. They're using it. We're already seeing it being used against us, whether it's some of the most advanced phishing campaigns that we've seen in years, where it's no longer the case that it's a poorly written by a foreign national that doesn't get your name right and has weird stuff in the header that you can easily pick out. These are crafted for you, Mark. They're gonna the AI can learn enough about you to craft not just a phishing email, but could actually do, we've seen examples of voice calls that are phishing, to even video interactive chats. There was an example a couple months ago of a company the attackers basically did a deep fake video with the chatbot of the CFO, and were able to convince a financial person in that organization to transfer $25 million. And let's face it, if you're chatting online with your, in this world where everyone does things remotely, with your CFO, and he or she is telling you, transfer this money to this account, we need this done ASAP, and you're having an interactive chat with that person, guess what? You're going to do your job as you see it. And that is an advanced level of use of AI that we just hadn't seen before. They're already doing it. We're seeing it in their reconnaissance. So one of the more mundane parts of the adversary is scanning the internet, looking for open ports or different services, mapping those to potential vulnerabilities that I can exploit. So how do I find out if I can attack you with a vulnerability, let's say in Log4j? Well, I got to scan your services, see if anything responds. That's right now we have sort of tools that can go do automated testing and evaluation, but the AI takes it to another level. Number one, it allows you to do it at a much larger scale, so you can analyze larger sets of data, but also it allows you to do that correlation. And so they're using AI to both scan the available services of a given enterprise and do the correlation. Okay, I'm seeing this response that maps to this kind of web server. There's an active exploit that I can go get from the dark web and marry that up and deliver the attack. And so we're seeing the speeding up of the kill chain, if you will, of exploit to mapping to a particular company or to a particular service. The other side of it is they can go off and scan every GitHub repository and to do analysis at scale of finding vulnerabilities, finding misconfigurations, finding default passwords that were populated into there, or that someone put information into a chat or a knowledge base article, and they're able to consume that information at a much broader scale than the more manual or individual tool-based approach of the past. And so the adversaries are absolutely taking advantage of this technology, and we're only just seeing the cusp of what they can do armed with AI. I've heard that there's deep web chatbots that are interactive that allow you to sort of investigate code and have it pop out samples for your exploit and to be able to do configuration. So while we as individuals and my developers say, oh, AI can't build good code, they're going to only build mediocre code, and I'm not going to use AI to do coding. At the scale that the attackers, they don't need to be successful 100% of the time like your web server has to be able to service your citizens. If they get 10% hit rate, that's still making money. And so they're much quicker to adopt these technologies, even in the early stages of maturity, because it gives them value. It reduces their time to getting their exploit out there, reduces their cost. And the other really interesting thing from a forensics perspective, if an AI generated your exploit, it's a lot harder to tie it back to an individual.
Right. That's a
and
really
so
point.
any signatures that you see start to get obfuscated because, well, I asked the dark web chatbot to generate this exploit and pull together this malware. So the best you're going to do is say, okay, we figured out it was from a dark web chatbot. Well, that doesn't really help me. It's telling me if it's this nation state or this crime unit. So we're starting to see that have an effect as well. So the AI being used against us is here. And it's not just in the classic cybersecurity. The whole deepfake thing is a big concern for both governments and organizations, not just from the phishing campaigns, but from the misinformation campaigns. Whether that be, we're in election season, so it could be election misinformation, to things like imagine a chatbot going out there and putting out deepfakes and other false information about a company. And now you can tank the stock price. And if somebody overseas shorted that stock, well, they're going to make a lot of money. And then all it cost them was using an AI. And so those kind of misinformation campaigns are starting to be something that a lot of folks are concerned about because there isn't an easy fix. It's not like I can throw a firewall at that problem. And so this is really why when we hear Congress or policymakers talk about the threat and concern around deepfakes, they're really talking about a bigger set of issues about AI-generated content that can cause damage. And it's being used in a variety of ways. So I think from a adversaries' perspective, they're already adopting it. From the defender side of the camp, I want to look at it from two sides of the coin, because there are two ways to look at this problem of AI and security. One question that every organization should be asking, one side of the coin, is how do I secure my AI? How do I protect it? And a lot of conversations are talking about the end state. So how do I protect the AI once I've deployed it? We need to also focus on how I built it. Who built it? How was it built? Where did the data come from? And how can I get visibility back into that development lifecycle, that MLOps pipeline, the machine learning operations and the deployment, development, the tuning, all those steps can be points of where things can go awry, either maliciously or just poor coding practices or mistakes propagate forward. But I think the interesting topic that, as you mentioned that you wanted to focus on is how can we as defenders use AI to get, to help combat the next generation of cyber attacks, as well as what we're firefighting with today. And when we look at that, I think there are a couple of ways we need to look at it. A lot of folks, and there's a lot of product vendors out there that are talking about how we're using AI to do our insert name of security thing here. And some of them are using some really cool AI. Some of them are just using pattern matching on steroids. It's really not it's machine learning, but it's not like deep neural network or graph analytics or large language and generative AI. It's just better pattern matching, which helps accelerate their ability to catch what they already know. The ones that are doing some really innovative things are looking at where AI can provide some of that correlation analysis, prediction, being able to detect, so I've seen an event, how does that correlate to something that may be an attack, and get quicker time to identification. So there's a lot of focus on that. And so you're going to find agents that have an AI engine. And there's a lot of really good technology out there that both in established companies as well as in the startup community. But I would posit that one of the biggest ROIs, return on investments for organizations that are looking to enhance their cybersecurity with AI, will not be looking at the AI to try to find that next really cool APT or detect the next wave of supply chain attacks. The actual biggest benefit is turning the AI inside and helping to deal with what I call the 80% of the stupid stuff. The daily firefighting, patch management, vulnerability assessment, asset management, correlation to vulnerability and exploit reporting. The work that you think about your typical cybersecurity team inside an organization, they're understaffed, underfunded, and have no sleep.
Right.
And part of the problem is they're constantly firefighting because there are firewalls and devices and systems and clouds are being constantly hit by the adversary. And those adversaries, everything from script kiddies to nation state actors. So everyone is going after everybody. And so they're constantly in this model of, well, I got to go, find out what this blip on the firewall dashboard is. I got to track it down. I've matched it to a vulnerability that's being exploited. Okay, I got to go patch it and test it. All of that, what I'm calling mundane, day-to-day stuff, can be automated with AI. It can be accelerated with AI, and we can basically use these AIs and target that 80%. And what that does is, number one, it gets us faster time to close those vulnerabilities and those exposures. There was a report that came out not too long ago about the window of exposure between the point a vulnerability is discovered and the time that it actually gets patched on a system can range from like 150 to 270 days. And that is ridiculous.
That's way too long.
It's way too long.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing that the other curve is how fast between a vulnerability being disclosed to an exploit being available is, depending on the day, is sometimes negative numbers because they actually already built the exploit before it was disclosed. But it's really in that 0 to 1 week. So now you've got all that time that you're potentially exposed to the attack. Now, if I can use an AI to close that window and be able to close it significantly by automating the testing, automating the patch, automating the discovery of what was the vulnerability that I need to patch, and do all of that through an AI set of tools and machine learning processes, I can reduce my time of exposure, quicker time to uptime if something goes wrong. And here's the most important thing from an IT organization. I've now freed up my precious resources to go focus on the 20% hard stuff that those mundane activities can address. And number one, they'll be happier because they'll be doing interesting work. Yeah. They'll have better sleep, hopefully. But more importantly, it's a better use of those precious funds you have to fund the team to do those things that an AI or an automated set of processes can't do. So I would posit that we're going to see a lot of AI everywhere. Everyone's going to adopt AI for cybersecurity in some fashion. But the biggest return to organizations when they invest, the meager dollars they have to enhance their cybersecurity, will be looking on the inside and being able to address those 80% things. And here's the cool part. Unlike those 20% or 10% weird behavioral things that where there's very little data. You have one example. You really can't train AI well on one example. We have terabytes, petabytes of examples of the day-to-day activities of yet another vulnerability, generating an alert that then needs to be patched. That activity and the data sets are correlated with that are rich, and most organizations have that. They can train their AI on that. So they have the available data, they just have to capture it and feed it into the engine. But what that means is that I don't have to do something interesting and exquisite that's a one-off. I can use the AI on things that because AI is data hungry. The more data you give it, the better it is. So it's it's the best use of AI to go after things where I have a lot of data, I have a lot of processes that I can identify that can be automated, and then let the engineers focus on the things that are the exquisite problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fascinating. I have many questions, but I think I'll just ask two following up from that. One, maybe a little bit more tangible. So if we're looking at that example where the CFO was deep faked, and some finance employee shifted millions of dollars out. Do you have maybe even a resource or some idea about how organizations can deal with that internally? I know it's super new, and it's not something that an AI can fix. I think this is more human aspect. And then the second question, which I think kind of moves into a different conversation here, is about this idea of human labor, right? So yes, we're having the low quality or the mundane skills and tasks that you mentioned being automated. But I want to look more into like the next 5 years or something like that, because as AI is going to get smarter and better, is that window of the 20% of interesting tasks going to slowly shrink for these cybersecurity experts going on? But why don't we start off with the first question?
Both really good questions. And in the online community, in the cybersecurity community, when that attack happened, there was a rich conversation. Well, how would you have stopped that? What policy or technology could I have applied to stop that? And the reality is there is no one tool. But there was some really interesting guidance and thoughts that went into that. And I'll give you a couple examples. So one, that for that particular attack is if the financial analyst had asked thinking they were the CFO, but in this case an AID, just to wave. And the reason is that deepfakes are really good at doing my face and with my upper body, but random gestures like this are something that most of them aren't trained on.
So for those that are only listening to audio, Steve is waving his hands, so he's
yes.
not a deepfake.
Exactly. So something like that, just ask him to do something that's different from just what you're seeing. So waving, give me the okay, something along those lines would have tripped up that particular example. It would have dealt with that one, but it's not a policy that it's a great idea. The other recommendation is for anything like that, like a two-man rule, a two-person rule. So with the CFO coming in, and again, they had hacked into the system, so it looked like it was coming from a legitimate Teams call or whatever have you, but having that person be able to do a validation check before executing the transfer. And whether that's having another person in the approval chain or having the CFO, go off that mechanism for that amount of money and come in through another. So a different vector. So for instance, having them call you on your cell phone at that moment would have prevented. And so having that double check, that extra trust verification is one of those things that by policy we should do. Now, the question comes down to where do you draw the line? Is $100 too little? Is 25 million too much? So where do you draw that line of I need a double check on anything above a certain amount? It's really about reducing your risk. It's not going to eliminate it, because wherever you put below the line, an attacker could go after, but you have to realize they're spending time and energy on that particular attack, and so you want to raise the bar low enough so that the amount of money they would get does not sufficiently enable the attacker, but also doesn't slow down business because you're doing millions of transactions. So there is that policy, and a lot of that has to do with the risk. A financial institution may have a higher or lower bar than, say, a manufacturing plant that's got very tight margins, and so it will be a policy that's unique to that organization. The other is, again, a policy around how those kind of conversations can happen. In this case, it was over an online chat with a video interface that led to that transaction. And really, if you're going to create a policy, sometimes you can do a double check. The other is you can say, well, okay, great, but that's the CFO can't ask you to do that, and you make that a policy. And so you educate your teams. No CFO should be able to to have you transfer money from that vector. They have to use something else. And so you force them into a more trusted environment performing that function. Now, there's some really cool research and some open source tools out there for doing deepfake detection. And they are just starting to take off. We've seen a couple of companies. Intel has some stuff we've put out in the open based on some university research around how to detect deepfakes. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll start to see those become more integrated into the media and collaboration systems we're using to be able to detect when I'm getting deepfaked, whether that's, when I'm looking at social media, can I tell if that's really a picture of Mark talking to me, or is he being deepfaked? And we can do that not by knowing Mark, but by looking at things like biomarkers. Are your eyes keeping tracking, or are they going split? Is the blood in your veins actually following a normal rhythm? Those kind of things are very hard to fake. And so there's those technologies are going to become more pervasive, but we're still early days. And so really it comes back to, for that particular attack, policy, double checking and making sure that you are in fact talking to a human. Now,
Very interesting. Yeah.
so so then your other question, and now I've completely forgotten what the other question
No,
was.
it's fine. I'll restate it. It's about the human labor aspect. So
Yes.
these mundane tasks being eradicated or taken over by AI, humans moving more to this 20%, but over time, is it going to be like 10%, 5%, 1%? Like, I guess my ultimate question is, are we just going to live in a world where it's AI attackers and AI cybersecurity bots conflicting each other, and the humans are out of the loop?
So are we going to have just a world of AI and AI violence?
Yes.
I like it.
Yes. Yes.
So there's something to be said for that. DARPA held a grand challenge a couple of years ago about automated attack bots and automated defenders, and there were no humans other than watching, and these systems went at each other. And I think we're going to see some of that because as the adversaries take on more generative and adversarial AI tools to build more powerful, not just the malware itself, but actually embedding AI in the malware so that it can actually, quote, think artificially in the environment once it gets in, instead of waiting for command and control, is one of those next evolutionary waves that we have to be worried about. Because today, once the malware gets in, it looks around for what it knows, and then it waits for somebody to tell it what to do. If I can enable a malware to have some intrinsic AI so that it can get in there and understand the environment and make decisions about, that database looks interesting, I'm gonna go after that, or I see a credential here, maybe I'll use it in this way, and actually automate some of the things that they wait for command and control on, they're gonna become much more powerful, and we need to have a defensive set of tools and agents that can come after that. But to your point about the human side of it, I think there's a balance. We have seen every time there's been a major shift in the evolution of technology and automation that it does affect people's jobs. We saw this in the industrial evolution. We've seen it with automotive. We've seen it with every major industrial, and AI is like that in some respects, where some of the more mundane tasks get automated and either people lose their jobs or they have to be retrained to do other things. At the same time, when we look at some of the more exquisite jobs, and there's a couple areas where we've got really good examples that there will never be an AI overload replacement for. I think the arts are going to be one for sure. I mean, it can generate some really beautiful art, but it's not going to give you Shakespeare.
Right.
It will give you something that's a good replication of Shakespeare, but it's going to lack the soul and the heart that we find in the arts. And we find that in a lot of the sciences, we see that as well. At the end of the day, and I'm going to pick on two examples, AI today can do a much better job of detecting cancer in an MRI than a human doctor can, even the most experienced one. And it's not because it's smarter than that doctor per se, but it's trained on the identifications that hundreds of thousands of doctors have made that you as an individual doctor only see, you've seen everything in your life, but you haven't seen everyone else's lives.
Right.
So it's much better. But at the end of the day, the doctor, whether it be the radiologist or the oncologist who's looking at the results, think of it not as a replacement, but as a tool to help them get quicker to. So when it can go and look at a scan that a doctor may have missed because it's too small to detect, and they even say, well, I've seen this across thousands or millions of radiographs or MRI images, and I can tell you that this is going to become cancerous, then the oncologist can say, okay, great, I understand that and I can act on that information. The same is going to be true of a cybersecurity professional. Cybersecurity professionals today, even if the AI is doing a much better job on the particular task, ultimately it's the understanding the risk environment, understanding the appropriate way to deploy something with the human element, because at the end of the day, systems are used by humans. The AI may decide, well, it's better to lock up this system over here, but that system happens to be the system that turns on the machine that pays everyone's paycheck. You're not going to want to do that. And so what we'll find is that the AI will give much more powerful tools to the cybersecurity professional. Will they have to be building scripts anymore? Maybe not. The AI will generate those. Will they be building the most exquisite C code we've ever seen? Probably not, and that's okay. There'll be jobs for coders. But I think what we'll find is that Venn diagram of things that people do as their day job because they have to, versus things where the AI can come in and automate or do that job for you, not instead of you. And I think that's the perception. The misperception is that the AI is going to replace everybody, even in 5 years. I think as the AIs get better, we are going to get better, and we're going to be focusing on the next thing, as opposed to, like you said, many of those mundane tasks. A great example is, and a friend of mine had this. They worked in a food manufacturing plant, And for the longest time, they were doing, basically interacting with the machine. Eventually, the machines got smart enough, better enough with the quality, they didn't need a human doing that interaction anymore.
Right.
So that person went back, took a couple courses, and became a service technician for the machine. We're going to still need people who understand those domains, who are food processing experts, and understand the machines and the AIs to make sure to keep them on track. And therefore, that domain experience isn't a lost capability, but it's refocusing it on, instead of making the food, you make the thing that makes the food better.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see that, with coders, with cybersecurity professionals, we may not have to do a lot of the mundane tasks as AIs get better, but it'll be our jobs to actually, how do we deploy that tool? How do we optimize that tool? How do we make sure the tool's getting the right data or seeing the right things and keep it in check? And let's face it, we're seeing examples today where AIs can go astray fairly quickly. So the cybersecurity professional of 5 years from now is going to be the cybersecurity AI professional, because they're going to need to protect the AI that's protecting them from attack. And so that will be the new surface area.
What a fascinating world we're moving into, huh?
Indeed.
It really is. I have so many questions, and the time is dwindling down here. I definitely want to ask you about Intel. So how is Intel, I guess, supporting this new era that we're moving into? I'll just leave the simple questions there.
So it's a big question to unpack, Mark.
Yeah.
So let's look at it from a couple perspectives. So the old moniker, which is still around, of Intel Inside, really is true. Our technology is in the edge, it's in the network, it's in the cloud, it's in the data center, it's everywhere, it's end to end. And so what that affords us is the opportunity to look at the problem from an end-to-end perspective. So instead of trying to say, well, how do I protect the cloud, or how do I protect the edge sensor, or how to protect an AI running here, which is important, you can look at the holistic problem. So how would I protect the AI life cycle? How do I protect the data throughout every stage of its process? Those are the kind of questions where Intel is looking to answer, as well as some of the tactical ones. So let's focus specifically on security and on two key areas I'll highlight. So one is, how do we use AI to do a better job of securing our devices? And so one of the things that some of our researchers and engineers came up with was that at the end of the day, whether you're running Windows operating system or Microsoft Word or Oracle database or a piece of malware or ransomware, you're running on the CPU. And you're taking up cycles, you're using threads, you're making I/O, you're doing functions. And so one of the techniques that we looked at is, how does a CPU monitor performance on a platform? It has little counters that it keeps track of applications and how they're performing, so that a developer or an organization can optimize or tune their application by seeing the performance at the raw CPU level. One of the things they identified is that ransomware, crypto mining, many of the advanced persistent threats, and even next generation malware behave a certain way. No matter how it's been built, at the end of the day, it's doing certain kind of functions at the lowest level. And so what they did is they actually took the data from running many samples of malware and ransomware on CPUs with these counters on, and actually were able to train AI to detect those behaviors. And so what we've done is, we call this the threat detection technology, is we've exposed those heuristics, those models now, to the ISV ecosystem, to the security vendors, to the operating system vendors, so that they get that deep visibility to be able to detect you've got ransomware. And one of the really interesting things about it is that you could have 20 different applications. You could have 4 different word processors from 4 different companies. At the CPU level, they're all going to run basically the same way. They're doing the same kind of things. The same is true of ransomware. The same is true of many of these advanced persistent threats. A lateral move with a vulnerability exploit or a memory overflow is the same across any application. The techniques they use are the same, and so they can be modeled and they can be identified. And so when we talk about sort of using AI to detect those really cool, nifty things, as well as the mundane, using performance primitives on the CPU to detect that is one of those next wave things that Intel's enabled. And companies like CrowdStrike and Microsoft Defender and others have adopted this technology to more quickly identify that aberrant behavior associated with ransomware. So that's on the edge side of the camp. How do we detect the next wave of threats and do it quickly and shut it down before it gets catastrophic? The other side of it, and this is something that gets talked about a lot, is that I've spent thousands of hours in the cloud training this AI model, millions of dollars on the data, and now I'm going to deploy it. How do I protect that AI? How do I keep it from being poisoned? How do I keep someone from stealing the weights in the model and then replicating all that work on their side, and especially in things like the biotech field, in pharmaceuticals or in other areas where there's a lot of IP built into that AI. And this is a use case for something the industry is calling confidential computing. And at its core, what confidential computing is being able to create a secure environment, a secure container for your application, in this case, for your inferencing, for the AI to live in, that is encrypted in memory. And that means that no access from the physical or digital world can get into that. And the access from other things on the system is controlled by the CPU. So you can come in with a digital attack, but the CPU is hardware that's preventing anything from getting in. Why this is important is it protects the application as it's running. It's called the last mile of data security and application security to be able to protect something in use. And so when we apply that to AI, I can now protect your model, keep it in a secure container or secure enclave, as it's called, and that prevents other tenants in the cloud from gaining access to your VM. It protects against a rogue administrator physically accessing the system, or in the case of deployed edge AI, someone walking up to your sensor and popping it open and trying to steal your secret sauce, or to corrupt. One of the things that you may not steal the IP, but if I know what weights you're using, and I want to be able to slip by your camera and coerce the image, having access to those weights gives me the data I need. And so protecting your AI wherever it lives, on the edge or in the cloud, is another key area that Intel is focused on. And it's about providing these core technologies. And this is, again, that Intel inside, building the technologies and enabling the ecosystem so that when you go to your Azure cloud, you can sign up for and click the box. I want confidential computing. It's there. And that's really the goal, is how do we light up the channel so make it easy for people to adopt these technologies, because most people don't understand how hardware works or how the software interfaces with hardware. They just want to use their antimalware agent on the edge, and they want to use a secure cloud on the cloud, and it should just do what it's supposed to do. And that's really where Intel is providing those kind of capabilities as examples.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It also kind of ties back to what we were talking about before, this increasing surface area, right? So before it was, you just have to worry about your hardware. Now you have to worry about the AI that's looking after your hardware and your software. Yeah, it's I love these podcasts. It's so interesting. Okay, I do see that the time is winding down. I have many more questions. I think one of the last ones that I'll ask you, though, is because you're working with public organizations, what are your thoughts on the speed at which government is moving with the speed at which the world is changing, right? There's this, and I'm going to butcher it, but there's this old idea of, government is X many years behind technology. You're working with these organizations very closely. Do you see that? Is that true? Are they able to keep up with the new kind of attackers that are coming out, or are the regulations and the policies and the bureaucracy slowing things down so that there might be a point where these attackers, whether nation state or otherwise, are actually able to infiltrate, say, the United States or the government or the CIA or anything like that with these new AI tools?
So I think the answer is you'll find everything in the government, because the government's a very large organization. So there's that stereotype that the government is old and years behind, and that's really not true, and yet it also is true. There are systems you'll find that are 20 plus years old and are still operational. But you have to remember, they were designed to operate for 20 years. How many of your laptops were ever designed to operate for 20 years? So it's not the same technology. It's not like you say, oh, they have an old laptop there. No, they have a system that was designed, the best example is Voyager's still communicating with us. And that was designed, in the 50s.
Right.
Yet it's still operating in a very harsh environment. So the things that get designed for the government that stick around for a long time are the ones that are meant to, or at least they were intended to do that. So there is a lot of technology debt there, and some of it is the scale, some of it is the bureaucracy, and some of the processes. But at the same time, you have the government adopting the latest grade, and they're on the bleeding edge, whether that be in organizations like DARPA that's driving research of the next generation, or even in the military and even civilian, adopting the latest technology. Most of your civilian organizations are on the cloud today. I know that might be, and the government took a proactive step many years ago to build a set of controls and requirements for how do you adopt cloud in a secure way. But they also, and this was FedRAMP when it came out a number of years ago, it changed the way the government contracted to enable it to take advantage of cloud. The old process of, I put out an RFP, you bid on it, and then I evaluate all the responders, and I say, okay, great, you build me this technology, and then it takes 6 months to certify that you did what I said you would do, and then if I want the next technology, I start all over again.
Right.
That just doesn't work in the cloud. And so something like FedRAMP, basically, once you got through once and you got your authority, what they call the authority to operate, you got certified to run this application in the cloud, and that cloud provider got authorized, now every other federal agency could inherit from that. And so what it allowed for is speeding up the process of adopting cloud, which is really what cloud is, because cloud isn't a one and then start over. It's a service model. It means subscription. It means being able to take one application, put it in, and take the next one and put it in the same kind of thing. So they changed the way they did contracting in anticipation of cloud services. And so what you'll find is definitely in the civilian agencies and even across the military, a large adoption of cloud. And there are large cloud contracts that are adopting cloud, but with the higher standard of security and monitoring and audit and authentication that you'd find for government versus for the private sector. So they have obviously a higher bar, but we're already seeing where the bar that they created is filtered out into regulated industries. So the government has been a vanguard in that respect. The standards that are used to secure systems in the cloud and the data center, those same requirements are used in Europe. They're used by financial services organizations, critical infrastructures. Basically, NIST puts out the recommendations, the standards, and the guidance. And it's a lot easier just to say, we're going to point to that one. That one works. Let's just use it for over here. And so we see the government on the leading edge of many technologies. So you see that dichotomy where they may have some really old technology still doing its mission and its job, and they have the latest and greatest. And that challenge that makes it federal sometimes interesting is how do you get those two talking to each other? And that's some of the fun. And in cases like, there's large organizations looking to modernize their architecture, because while this old stuff works, it doesn't scale, it's hard to integrate into. And so we're seeing a constant process of what they call digital transformation or digital modernization, moving legacy applications and codes onto more modern architectures. And a lot of that activity has been going on for many years. So to the question of how do they defend against the adversaries, the government is actually really well set up to defend against both nation state and cyber criminals. They have organizations whose sole job is to monitor and protect the internet connections of civilian in the DHS and of the military and intelligence community. And they have some of the most advanced tools, both from commercial as well as custom built, to do that kind of detection, prevention, and forensics and auditing. No one is 100% secure. There are examples of where government agencies have been hacked. Oftentimes it's a human error or it's a vulnerability that didn't get patched fast enough. That will always happen. But what you find, if you look at it at the end of the day, when you say who is set up organizationally and by policy to do the job that's needed, I find that the government is much more advanced because they care about security. Whereas if you look at your standard organization, the CISO is a constant battle for budget. In the DoD, they put out, here is our site, our zero trust architecture and the mandate that by 2027 you're going to be live. Like there's a plan, and here's how you're going to execute, and everyone's got to report. So it's at a higher level as far as the visibility and the budgeting to make it happen. Whereas again, inside organizations, it depends on your organization how much you care about cybersecurity. In the government, they care because they know it's critical to the national security and national infrastructure.
Glad you shared that. Okay, I see our time is almost up here, Steve. Final question, and I think I already know the answer to this, but what is your perspective on the future of cybersecurity? Are we going to be generally safe, or are the attackers going to take over and be able to infiltrate, businesses, governments, individuals? What's your overall kind of thought or feeling, dare I ask, on the future of this?
I'm going to give you two answers to that. I've been doing this now for over 30 years, and I could say that I've had job security for 30 years. There is always going to be for cybersecurity because there are always going to be adversaries. And so while I don't think the adversaries are going to just lay waste to everything, I don't think we're going to magically just solve everything and then go home. So there's always going to be that cat and mouse battle. And every time we think we solved something, we secured the web services come up and it blows up all our security assumptions. We got the web services, now mobile, and now it's a new service. So every time we think we got our handle on something new comes in and we start, yet again start from scratch. At the same time, where the optimistic side of me thinks that we're going to start to see, especially with some of the changes in the way we approach risk and risk management, the way we approach, the zero trust is just the beginning of a different way of thinking about security. So again, zero trust architecture, there's this great hype circle on it as well, but fundamentally, it's changing the way we look at security from once I trust you, you can do anything, to I don't trust you ever. And every time you're going to do something, I need to verify. I need to validate in this moment in time. And it's that default deny, so default no trust. Prove to me, as opposed to if you're, once you're in, you're good. That shift is actually going to go a long way to helping us get better at defending against things, because we're going to stop trusting implicitly transactions and software and hardware and things and connections on our network, and apply that rubric. And that's marrying that with risk management is how we do this to the organizational need. Some organizations have very sensitive information or have a lot of value. A bank has a lot of money involved. Other organizations have less so. This doesn't mean they're insignificant, but it allows you to sort of dial up your security up or down based on the risk at that moment. And so that capability, once we've deployed that, if we look out 5 years, we will be, I don't think we'll ever stop having to deal with the adversaries, but I think the cybersecurity team will at least look a little better and have less bags under their eyes.
Fantastic. Happy to hear that. Steve, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing your insights. Really interesting, and I'll have a whole bunch of other questions that maybe I'll have to ask you another time or ask another cybersecurity guest. I'll have your LinkedIn up on the show notes. Is there any other place that you want people to reach out or follow what you're doing?
That is honestly the best place to reach me. If you want to find out what Intel is doing in public sector, you can go to intel.com/public sector.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Steve, and wish you all the best on the cybersecurity journey with your work in Intel. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard here, there are, of course, a number of ways that you can support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes or the YouTube channel where you can see video recordings of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, please get in touch to hear about the strategic foresight services that we offer and how we can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living the highest standard living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.